This is a book called Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a Veggie Tales writer, I believe. And he wrote this book about how America is basically treating Christians like Germany treated Jews in the 30s. I mean, it's insane. I want to listen to it. This isn't part one. If you didn't see the others, don't sweat it. This stands independently of the rest. I'll give context if it's missing.
Chapter 4, The Church and the Jewish Question. 3 months after Bonhoeffer's sermon on January 31st, 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power as the Chancellor of the German nation.
Bonhoeffer, of course, is this Christian pastor in Germany in the 30s who was opposed to Hitler just for the sake of opposing him. And this guy wrote a book called Bonhoeffer, and he's obsessed with Bonhoeffer and rewrote his history.
Though he was wisely coy about the details, he was nonetheless deeply dedicated to fundamentally changing Germany. This meant bringing everything in German life, including the German church, into line with Nazi doctrines. Once he had the power and the opportunity to act, Hitler did so with lightning speed, and things changed very quickly. Some of the changes were official, in the form of legislation and decrees, as we shall see, but others were less obvious. For example, just 2 days after Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer gave an important radio address. It had been scheduled for some time, so he did not give it as a response to Hitler's ascension. But in that address, given...
That's true, yes. I know about this address, actually. I wrote about this subject at length in my own book, owenmorgan.com. It's on Amazon and Audible, Was Hitler an Atheist? And he gave this radio address 2 days after Hitler took power, basically. And basically he said, when the regime kind of inserts itself in where Jesus should be in people's lives, they become not a leader, but a misleader. And unfortunately, the last sentence or two got cut off. The radio show ended. It just abruptly stopped. Bonhoeffer remembers thinking, I can't believe that this happened so rapidly. That is not a fortuitous sign, if you will.
February 1933, Bonhoeffer spoke pointedly on leadership, and specifically on something called the leadership principle, Führerprinzip, an idea that had been popular in Germany over the previous 2 decades and which was centrally important to Hitler's view of himself. The German word for leader is Führer, and Hitler had, with evil brilliance, put himself forward as the leader, der Führer, that Germany needed at that time. He presented himself as the living embodiment of this idea, and there can be no question that it had...
Again, Eric Metaxas lies for a living about Bonhoeffer and the whole era. He doesn't know anything about the era. Or if he does, then he's outright intentionally misinforming people. I don't know which. So take everything you hear with a grain of salt. But so far, it sounds like it's been correct.
Messianic overtones to anyone paying attention, as Bonhoeffer certainly was. So when Bonhoeffer addressed the question of leadership in his speech, he was trying to explain that the biblical idea of leadership was dramatically and utterly opposed to Hitler's idea of it. The Bible speaks of servant leadership. He who would be first must be last. Jesus himself famously modeled this idea for his disciples on Maundy Thursday when he took on the role of a lowly slave and washed their feet. Bonhoeffer contended in his address that if a leader's main objective was to idolize himself, that leader was not exhibiting true, godly leadership, but was in fact a misleader of the people he pretended to lead.
Yep, and then it got cut off before you got to say that.
We in America have always understood the biblical idea of leadership, whether we explicitly recognized it as such or didn't. If we the people are to govern ourselves, we are obliged to reject the idea of leaders who do not serve those whom they lead. Though we have sometimes forgotten about it, our American idea of self-government comes to us in no small part from the biblical model in which the Israelites made a covenant directly with God. So we can easily see how the popular Führer principle that catapulted Hitler to power and helped him stay there would have been deeply distasteful to someone like Bonhoeffer. It was a bold and vital speech that Bonhoeffer gave that day on the subject. But because Hitler was now chancellor, something strange happened. Somewhere in the middle of the speech, the broadcast was cut off.
There you go, yeah.
No one knew for sure whether higher-ups in the Nazi regime made this happen, but it is hard to imagine that they hadn't.
Yeah, that's true. That was in Bonhoeffer's biography by Eberhard Bethge. It was right near the center of the book, actually, I think.
Circumstances in Germany had changed quite suddenly, and what would have gone swimmingly a week earlier might no longer work at all.
I believe it was 2 days before, so I think Hitler took power in January 31st, and then this happened on February 2nd, if I remember correctly.
To put it in our own modern parlance, Bonhoeffer had just been canceled. There were many similar
God, dude, he's going to talk about cancel culture, right? Here we go.
There were many similar experiences to come for him, but this was his own first taste of the new world into which all Germans had just entered. One of the important themes of Bonhoeffer's life story, and of this book too, is that we must change along with our circumstances.
Okay, I don't know what he's talking about here. What's he referring to? He says that pastors in in Nazi Germany didn't want to see the changes. I'm not sure what what he's talking about.
We will go into the roughly 4 reasons for this in the chapters following, but the fact is that because of their inability to see things clearly, they clung to what was safe, and in doing so, they markedly departed from leaning on God and trusting Him with what lay ahead.
That's not what happened. This guy has a vested interest in convincing himself and everybody around him that in World War II, the pastors they were afraid of changing anything, and so they wanted to keep it all the same. That's not what happened. 10% or so of the Protestant church stood vocally and openly against Hitler, the confessing church. And then another 15 or so percent stood in favor of Hitler, created a new denomination, and called themselves the Christian nationalists, or the Protestant nationalists, the evangelical nationalists, depending on how it's translated. The rest were intact churches, and they just kind of held the standard line of the rest of the Lutheran movement, which is what they were, mostly Lutherans. I just finished writing a book titled Was Hitler an Atheist? It talks about religions during the Third Reich and how they worked together. Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Protestants. And I even address the lies told by the evangelical world about Bonhoeffer. It's on Audible and Amazon. Okay, let's continue.
They had become so comfortable with business as usual that they had entirely forgotten how to lean on God. And so when things changed and it was dramatically required that they do so, they did not. As we have touched on already, a very similar dynamic is at work in the American church today.
Well, I mean, the dynamic he described is not at work in America, and the dynamic he described wasn't at work in Germany either. This is a completely fictitious situation.
Many pastors and leaders sincerely believe that we can and should continue as we've been doing for decades. We should preach the gospel and teach the Bible as we always have done, and we
Yeah, I mean, you're a church. Shouldn't that be like your main goal, teaching the Bible?
must act as though the current state of our culture and nation is essentially the same as it has always been. But
What does the culture and nation have to do with anything?
most people in the pews whom these pastors purport to lead know that things are not as they were even a few years ago. They are looking to their pastoral leaders to acknowledge this, to help them understand what is happening, and to lead them in standing against it. After all, isn't this precisely why they have been studying the Bible and listening to sermons over the years? Was not all of that preparation for this hour? But in most churches, the business as usual continues. As though they might kick the current troubles away, the leaders simply continue preparing for something in the future, which they seem to hope will simply never come. Many Christians are abandoning such churches for the few that are alive to the situation, where the pastors are less timid about saying what needs to be said. But in the increasing numbers of those churches that refuse to see where we are and address it, has God not already begun to bring about His judgment? Has He not already cursed the fig tree? But to better understand where
I have no idea what he's talking about
we
here.
are, we return to the German church at the beginning of the Nazi regime. As soon as Hitler came to power, he swiftly began to make his moves toward subduing it. He knew the amicable history between the German church and state would make it unlikely that many would see what he was up to.
Amicable history. No, the church and the state were irreparably linked. Like they were one in the same. The church got funding from the state, and the church was only legitimate if it had state control. That's how they viewed it.
Of course, he did not speak openly about what he had in mind, because if anyone was shrewd as a serpent, it was Adolf Hitler. But Bonhoeffer saw precisely what was happening and began to speak out about it to the German church leadership.
Dude, I love it. The pastors didn't fight against what Hitler was doing because they didn't see what he was doing. Are you for real right now? Everybody saw exactly what Hitler was doing, okay? Everybody knew. That it wasn't because they didn't know what he was doing, is because they liked it most of the time. Most of the churches, they were into it. They wanted to be part of the whole Nazi movement.
Saw clearly that a reckoning was on the horizon. It was not possible for the church to remain the church if it submitted to Nazi leadership. Biblical thinking and Nazi ideology deviated dramatically on fundamental points. But most
Sorry, let me step back. I accidentally pulled my headphone out.
Nazi leadership. Biblical thinking and Nazi ideology deviated dramatically on fundamental points. But most German Christian leaders simply did not see this when Hitler first took power.
Nazi beliefs were pretty easy to align with Christian values, actually, by simply changing a word here or there, or removing a verse, or ignoring a writer like Paul or whatever. They had to change the Bible very little to bring it in line with Nazi ideology.
They did not connect the dots. But Bonhoeffer did. It is extraordinary how quickly the Nazis moved to change things and how quickly they acted to destroy the democratic processes that had been in place for so long.
Oh, he's in favor of democracy now. Okay, go
But
on.
it is perhaps even more extraordinary to see how quickly Bonhoeffer recognized what was happening and responded to it. What the Nazis did first, a mere 4 weeks into Hitler's chancellorship, was to use the incident of the Reichstag fire, in which a Dutch madman set fire to the German parliament building, to enact sweeping emergency decrees that suddenly allowed Hitler to do things without the approval of the German parliament.
Well, I appreciate that he's not spreading the conspiracy theory that the Nazi movement was responsible for that, like that the Nazis were the ones that set the fire or whatever. And I've just now realized I can't get this item now. There's a shell belt. Oh no, I can get it. Sweet. I thought I needed the item finder to get that. That's cool. Anyway, wow, that's lucky. Yeah, what's his name? Oh my God. William Schreier? Is that his name? I think that's it. He wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He's not a historian, he's a journalist, which is fine, but he didn't know what he was talking about or what he was doing. And he wrote this like 900-page breakdown about the Third Reich and how it began and like what it was like to live under the dictatorship and everything else. And that's really interesting and really cool, but he got shit wrong like constantly. For example, he called it the confessional church, not the confessing church, the confessional church. That drove me nuts. And it's a little thing, like, okay, maybe it's a translating error, right? No, it wasn't. He also got like a bunch of other really weird stuff wrong. Like, he said that there were 17,000 pastors in the Protestant church. No, there were 18,000. Why would you say there were 17,000? No source says 17,000. It wasn't 17,000. It was 18,000. Just little tiny factual errors like that are like all through the entire book. And I can always tell when someone used that as their source. I can tell because they get so much shit wrong. Like Ray Comfort wrote a book on Hitler and his religious beliefs, and I could tell that he very clearly used that as his source. Because he got shit wrong all through it. Anyway, step back here.
Emergency decrees that suddenly allowed Hitler.
Yeah, Schreier's book claims that the Reichstag fire was orchestrated, planned, and executed by the Nazis, when it absolutely was not. We don't know who set the fire. We do. We do actually know. It was, what the hell was his name? It was a dude who got on a train on his way out, and then he ended up back at the Reichstag, and he had like a bunch of fuel and stuff and just poured it all over everything and just lit it up. And they caught him and were sufficiently convinced that it was just him. He was the only one involved. Nobody else is involved. We do know who it was, yeah. I can't remember the guy's name now, but yeah, he set the fire, without a doubt.
To do things without the approval of the German parliament. It was a stunning erasure of German government with blitzkrieg swiftness. It's still a question whether the Nazis themselves enabled the arson so they could use it as a pretext for what they did next.
No. Nobody wonders that. Nobody thinks that. This is just conspiracy theory.
Erasure of German government with blitzkrieg swiftness. It's still a question whether the Nazis themselves enabled the arson so they could use it as a pretext for what they did next.
No, it was useful to the Nazis, but they did not use it as a pretext. I'm sorry. It was useful to the Nazis. They did use it as a pretext, but they did not have any part in planning or executing the Reichstag fire. They didn't even know it was going to happen. It was just convenient.
The Nazis controlled the media narrative and instantly whipped up a hysterical fear of the communists and their other political opponents, whom they insisted were to blame for the burning of the Reichstag, despite evidence to the contrary. But it was a useful fiction, and in order to do the things they wished to do, they needed to demonize their enemies, many of whom were rounded up and imprisoned, and to crush dissent by instilling fear in anyone who wished to object. Can you think of parallels to our own time? The Reichstag fire paved the way for much else.
So I wonder, what parallel does he think we have today to the burning of the Reichstag? What does he think that Biden did or Obama did that is basically the Reichstag fire?
Soon thereafter, on April 7, 1933, Hitler signed the Restoration Act. In the Nazis' efforts to create a racially pure German state, they had included the so-called Aryan paragraph in this law, which suddenly made it illegal for anyone with Jewish blood to hold a government position.
Yep, With non-Aryan blood, actually. It wasn't Jewish blood, but okay, close enough, I guess.
In time, these anti Semitic restrictions would be extended to other professions, as the Nazis were always expanding their powers over German society. But it was the Aryan paragraph that clarified things rather dramatically for the German church.
Yes, absolutely. They included they included the Aryan paragraph in like the church, in like the church confessions or whatever, and it very clearly violated the church confessions. Like it says anyone who comes to Jesus or anyone who comes to God in the name of Jesus will be saved. It's pretty clear on that, right? The Aryan paragraph said you can't be a minister, or in some people's interpretation was you can't be a Christian if you are Jewish. That is in clear violation of the confession.
And brought things to a head because the German Lutheran Church was officially part of the German government. Could the German church suddenly change its doctrines to submit to the Nazis' racial ideology? As almost everyone knows, in the Christian church, anyone who adheres to its beliefs is welcome. So if in Germany a pastor happened to have Jewish blood, as many did, this was perfectly immaterial. In fact, Bonhoeffer's closest friend at that time, Franz Hildebrand, was ethnically Jewish.
That's true.
He had come to believe in the doctrines of the Christian church and to be baptized, and like Bonhoeffer, was ordained as a pastor.
Yes.
If the Aryan paragraph was accepted by the German church, as the Nazis insisted, Hildebrand and any other ethnically Jewish pastors would be legally barred from serving. Naturally, this was unacceptable to Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, he's just describing the fight over the Aryan paragraph. That's accurate.
How could the German state dare tell the Church of Jesus Christ who its members and leaders could be? The church always had the freedom to determine this. The biblical view is that God looks on our hearts and doesn't care whether someone who believes in Jesus is a Jew or a non-Jew. And of course, Jesus was himself a Jew, as were each of the 12 disciples, and most in the early church. That the Nazi government would suddenly wipe away 2 millennia with one stroke and determine that the German church must be organized along racial and anti-Semitic lines was perfect madness and obviously untenable. But what's amazing and horrifying is that many in the German church, like many in the American church now, were willing to look the other way, even on something that touched the very fundamentals of the faith in which they professed to believe. They wished to get along and not to be seen as troublemakers. But Bonhoeffer was not among them, nor were those in what was then called the Emergency Pastors League, a group of heroic pastors who saw what was...
The Emergency Pastors League was the predecessor to the Confessing Church, and it was started by Martin Niemöller. And by the time the Emergency Pastors League gave its first decree, I believe, Bonhoeffer was already gone. He was already out of the country. He went to London, I believe, to teach at a seminary there. People like to portray Bonhoeffer as the creator and leader of the Confessing Church, and the Pastors Emergency League is what it was, actually PEL, Pastors Emergency League. This is one of those little things that drives me nuts. They get things wrong constantly. Anyway, they like to portray him as like the leader of the PEL or the Confessing Church. He wasn't at all in any way. Google it right now. Let's look. Who was the leader of the Confessing Church, Germany? Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Look at this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer listed. Why? Why is Dietrich Bonhoeffer listed here? He had nothing to do with the Confessing Church or the PEL or anything. He wasn't even in the country. Karl Barth and Martin Niemöller worked together to write the decree that created the Confessing Church, the Barmen Declaration. So I guess you could say that Karl Barth helped create the Confessing Church. Martin Niemöller was the leader of it. Bonhoeffer was not in the mix anywhere. This drives me insane. I cannot stand all the misinformation.
happening and turned to Bonhoeffer to think through and put in
All right, let's step back just a few seconds here. One more time.
called the Emergency Pastors League.
The Pastors Emergency League, PEL.
A group of heroic pastors who saw what was happening and turned to Bonhoeffer to think through and put in writing what he believed were the church's obligations under the dramatically changing circumstances. In April 1933, Bonhoeffer wrote his essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, in which he spells out rather clearly what he saw as the German church's role in dealing with the circumstances arising from a state hostile to Christian belief.
Right. April 1933, there was a big boycott, April 1st, in fact, of Jewish-owned stores, and it was ugly, real ugly. It was almost like Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where there's just a giant riot against Jewish people. Anyway, April 1933 is a boycott. Things start going downhill, and Pastors Emergency League forms, I believe, in September 1933. Bonhoeffer posts a bunch of like leaflets on trees and stuff in the area saying we can't we can't abandon our non-Aryan brothers and stuff. And it just fed the propaganda machine that Hitler was pushing at the time. I didn't realize this was going to be so heavy on the subject. It wasn't previously, but here we are. Was Hitler an atheist? OwenMorgan.com. I write about it at length. Amazon and Audible also. Anyway, September, he tried to post the handbills and stuff. October, Bonhoeffer left for London. He abandoned ship. He said, I'm gone. November, I think 1st, the elected head of the Protestant church, Ludwig Müller, ordered all of the 18,000 pastors involved in the church to turn over the proof that they are of Aryan descent. And the Pastors Emergency League, the PEL, Martin Niemöller, told people to ignore it in their first official newsletter after Bonhoeffer was already gone. That's actually how things played out.
If anyone doubts whether Bonhoeffer believed Christians could get political, they need only read this document, which may be summed up by its 3 central points. First...
Oh, he's going to read us the, wait a minute, I know it. I wrote about it in my book. Oh my God, what's it called? I don't remember the name of it now. But anyway, the church and the state were inextricably linked at the time. They were political. But in the end, being political was the problem. The fact that the church was political allowed Hitler to manipulate them. It was that they weren't staying out of politics. That was the problem.
Summed up by its 3 central points. First, Bonhoeffer said, the church was the conscience of the state and must call it to account that it must loudly object if the state was doing wrong.
No, that's not right. Is he talking about a different document?
It could not and must not remain silent when injustices and wrongs were being promoted and enacted. Second, he said that the Christian church was obligated to help any victims of the state. For Bonhoeffer, that clearly included the Jews. But thirdly, and most dramatically, Bonhoeffer concluded that if the state refused to change course and do the right thing, but rather continued in its sins, which in this case were principally focused on persecuting the Jews, it was the solemn obligation of Christians to take action.
Bro, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. He did write a document with 3 points, and he tried to get it passed as like a document that the church would use to kind of guide their actions moving forward on the subject. And the interim president of the church, of like the entire Protestant church, Bodelschwing was his name, Fritz von Bodelschwing, he cut the last point off, which kind of neutered his points. I don't know what the hell Metaxas is talking about right now. Is he just making this up right now?
They were not merely to protest verbally and to help the victims, but were also to become actively political, to shove a stick in the spokes of the wheel of the rumbling machine of the state.
Yeah, I don't know what he's talking about here. It wouldn't surprise me if he just like completely made this up. Being political was the problem.
To some pastors who heard Bonhoeffer deliver this essay, it was all rather shocking. Some even walked out. But already in early 1933,
This is bullshit. Churches were political by default. There was no separation between church and state. He is just making this up. This drives me insane. Dude has a best-selling book titled Bonhoeffer. He is considered an authority on the subject. That infuriates me to levels I cannot articulate.
Shocking. Some even walked out. But already in early 1933, Bonhoeffer saw and said that those who call themselves Christians have an obligation to God to get political if necessary and to take a bold...
This is just lie. He's lying. This is all lies.
...and likely dangerous stand against their own government. This was a markedly radical departure from the default mode of the German churches since the time of Luther, whose memorable embracing of Romans 13 constituted a kind of summum bonum on the subject.
This is a lie. This is not true. He's just flat out lying. The German church was political by default. They believed that you weren't a valid religious body unless you were integrated into the government. He is rewriting history, fabricating information to push a Christian national agenda.
As though it was all that needed to be said about the relations between church and state, as we shall explain. Chapter 5, 12,000 pastors. As it happened, what Bonhoeffer so clearly said in The Church and the Jewish Question was not at all clear to most pastors in
12,000 pastors. We're on chapter 5 now. Let me think. There were 18,000 total. 2,000 were associated with the confessing church in some way. 3,000 were affiliated with the Christian nationalists, basically the German Christians, the Nazified Christians. He's probably saying that, well, that's only 17,000. Why is he saying 12,000? It'd be 13,000. Anyway, they called themselves, the ones in the middle, they call themselves intact churches because they just followed the instructions of the Greater Lutheran Church and didn't get involved in politics, for the most part, not on a church level.
Germany. They balked at its conclusions, which seemed to them premature and radical. Even many of those whom Bonhoeffer knew to be his allies in this fight thought he was being unmeasured and hasty in pushing them to take a united and dramatic stand against the Nazis. Surely the Nazis might be reasoned with. Surely things would shape themselves in a more positive direction over time.
Well, I mean, even Bonhoeffer hoped that. Everybody thought that might be the case. He didn't know how bad Hitler was going to be.
It would never do for august pastors and ministers to seem unreasonable or nakedly political or, God forbid, political enemies of the
This is just bullshit. This whole thing is bullshit.
state. This was tremendously frustrating for Bonhoeffer because he knew that unless the German church leaders clearly saw the urgency of what was happening and acted with even greater urgency, all would be lost. As long as they dithered and debated, the Nazis would retain the upper hand and would win. Did these pastors not understand that things had changed dramatically and that they must respond dramatically? With each day that passed, the deeply unscrupulous Nazis masterfully exploited the scrupulousness, or actually the over-scrupulousness, of the timid pastors, and thereby consolidated more power. The clock was ticking, and Bonhoeffer saw that if the German church was not decisive and heroic in that hour, it would soon lack even the ability to fight back. It would be taken away from them. Indeed, it was being taken away from them with every minute that passed. The window was closing on whatever chances they had. Did they not understand that actually being a follower of Jesus entailed radical obedience? Did they not remember that Luther had faced death, and that many who had followed him had faced death, and that many were put to death? Did they think their Lutheran Christian faith was somehow exempt from such things?
It wasn't between arguing against the state and remaining unpolitical. It was between joining the German Christians, like the Nazified denomination, or the confessing church, the anti-Nazi denomination. It was a religious question, not a political question. But okay, just completely rewrite history, I guess.
Become of their faith so that it was now so flabby and unable to stand against the enemies of God in their time. As 1933 wore on, the main battle lines in the German church itself were shown to lie between the devotedly pro-Nazi Deutsche Christen, who zealously wished to help Hitler form and oversee a national Reich church on the
Deutsche Christen, German Christians,
one side, and those in what came to be called the Bekennende Kirche, the confessing church, on the other. It is always the temptation of a powerful state to push the church around, but in Germany, this was not an issue until the Nazis seized control. As we have said, in previous years and most recently under the Kaisers, the German church was comfortably aligned with the German state. But suddenly the leader of the state was Adolf Hitler, who privately despised the church and Christianity generally, though he certainly wouldn't say so openly. He worked very cannily in giving the German church the idea that he was with them, all the while working to co-opt and undermine them. Those in his inner circle knew precisely what he thought of the church and its despicable Jewish theology, and they knew he had inordinate ambitions to bring it to heel under his own leadership. But it had to be done carefully. Bonhoeffer, along with such other figures as Martin Niemöller and Karl Barth, knew they must draw a line in the sand.
Martin Niemöller was the leader of the Confessing Church, and before that, the Pastors' Emergency League. And Karl Barth was a Swiss theologian that helped create the Confessing Church. He helped write the Barmen Declaration that brought it into existence.
If the Nazis succeeded in creating a Reich church subservient to Hitler, the church in Germany would effectively be dead. We should say that whenever a church is subservient to the state or to the reigning worldly culture, as the official church in communist China is today, it is no longer the Church of Jesus Christ. It is a counterfeit church that does not serve Jesus, but that serves the forces of power, which is to say, it serves the devil. Before the Nazis could murder the actual Christian church, the aforementioned Christian leaders in 1934 drafted and published what has come to be called the Barmen Declaration.
Yeah, that's what we've been talking
It
about.
essentially said that the German state must not and could not co-opt the church.
That is not true. Oh my God, dude. The Barmen Declaration's really simple and straightforward, actually. Declaration. Let me look. Let's see. 1934. Barmen Declaration of or the Theological Declaration of Barmen, 1934. Was a document adopted by Christians in Nazi Germany who opposed the German Christian movement, which is the Christian nationalists. In the view of the delegates to the Synod, which is like a church assembly, that met in the city of Wuppertal Barmen in May 1934, the German Christians had corrupted church government by making it subservient to the state and had introduced Nazi ideology into the German Protestant churches, that contradicted the Christian gospel. So here are the 6 theses that it included. 1. The only source of revelation is the Word of God, Jesus Christ. Any other possible sources, earthly powers, for example, will not be accepted. 2. Jesus is the only Lord of all aspects of personal life. There should not be another authority. 3. The message and order of the church should not be influenced by the current political convictions. 4. The church should not be ruled by a leader or Führer. There is no hierarchy in the church. Matthew 20:25f. 5. The state should not fulfill the task of the church and vice versa. State and church should both be limited to their own business. Oh boy, that's an interesting little point to leave out, isn't it? Wow. I totally forgot that was in there. And 6, therefore, the Barmen Declaration rejects the subordination of the church to the state and the subordination of the word of the Spirit to the church. Okay, I don't know what that means, but that's interesting, huh? Number 5, state and church shall remain separate. They didn't care about that in Germany until the state tried to interfere with the church. Of course, it was fine when they were doing it the other way around. But man, I love it that you think Eric Metaxas is going to address point number 5 in the Barmen Declaration? Something tells me no.
Drafted and published what has come to be called the Barmen Declaration. It essentially said that the German state must not and could not co-opt the church, that the sanctity and separation of the church from the state must be clear. All who signed this document were known as the Bekennende Kirche, or Confessing Church, and they declared it to be the true church in Germany.
Okay, I guess he addressed it kind of.
Free from Nazi interference and submitted only to God. But what is shocking to us today is that most pastors in Germany were not willing to sign it. Either they were not thinking clearly on the subject at hand, and as a result were not thinking biblically, or perhaps they were thinking clearly enough.
The vast majority. I think only 6,000 agreed with the tenets, but ultimately only 2,000 would put their name on behind it and actually stand behind it.
But they simply did not have the courage to act on what they knew to be true. Perhaps they, like so many in the American church today, thought it safer to sit on the sidelines and do nothing, to see which way the wind was blowing, so to speak. It is worth noting that the great Charles Colson saw troubling signs here in America, and taking a page from the Barmen Declaration, along with Princeton's Robert P. George and Beeson Divinity School's Timothy George, drafted what came to be called the Manhattan Declaration in 2009. It saw on the horizon what the American church is now facing and wished to get Christians and Christian leaders to sign it so that we might all, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, be on the record as standing firmly for biblical principles.
I don't know what the Manhattan Declaration is. I haven't heard of that. But I do know that this guy's lied all through this entire thing. So take it with a grain of salt.
With regard to the state. For example, the state could not force medical professionals to perform abortions or to do anything that might violate their religious liberty.
Brother, no one has ever tried to do that. This is fictitious, okay? It's in your head. This has never happened.
The state could not force anyone to violate their biblical views regarding marriage between a man and a woman.
No one has ever done that. No one has ever tried to do that. You don't have to get gay married if you're straight and or Christian. No one is forcing that on you. You know what else they're not forcing on you? You're also not required to get trans-affirming surgery if you don't want. That is a choice that people can make. I know that, it's a surprise based on what Eric Metaxas is saying, but it's a choice.
And if the state did attempt to force Christians to violate their consciences, we were obligated to be civilly disobedient. The document cited Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail to this end. But just as with the Barmen Declaration, many high-profile pastors, many of whom were Colson's friends, nonetheless demurred in signing it. So many otherwise faithful pastors in Germany had done in the 1930s. They grasped at various theological straws to exempt themselves, and at many of precisely the same straws too. When Colson the following year read my newly published biography of Bonhoeffer.
Not a biography. It was complete trash. The real biographer of Bonhoeffer was his friend and student Eberhard Bethge. Eric Metaxas is not his biographer.
His feelings toward these pastors and friends at repeating these grave errors erupted in annotations in the book's margins, where he even named some of them, Begg, Piper, and MacArthur. How could these dear brothers, of all people, be so theologically fussy that they did not see what was at stake? We know that the unwillingness of so many in Germany to understand what was happening and to act decisively was fatal. In 1935, a year after the Barmen Declaration was drafted, there were roughly 18,000 Protestant pastors in Germany. We aren't sure exactly how many of them actually signed the Barmen Declaration and identified themselves with the Confessing Church.
We aren't? It was like 2000.
Seems to have been nearly 6,000. But
What? No. 6,000 did sign a document expressing support for some of the ideas expressed in the Barman Declaration, but 2,000 or so signed on to the confessing church. He's just like lying here. He can't not know that he's lying. He can't.